Go ahead and grab a seat and we'll get cooking. So today we continue on our journey through Thomas Ord's book with the help of his book called God Can't. And anyway, last week was on the startling side because the premise that he gave us, just to review a moment, his statement to rethink how we think about this stuff was God can't prevent evil single-handedly. That was the premise. And there was kind of an audible gasp when we said that out loud last week because at first glance, it's a startling statement because it goes against so many things that we've just kind of taken for granted in our theological thinking. And my hunch is that we have a lot of thoughts that we haven't thought about a lot. They're just there as undercurrents. I'm going to show you some more of those today that might get in the way of your capacity to relate to God, understand God, hear God, all of that. And it's helpful to know that all of our thinking about God, all of our images that we have are just that. It's metaphor. They're ways of thinking, and there's not one complete way of thinking that kind of solves everything. So we kind of need to enter into this thing loosely with our hands open to see what we think about all of this stuff. So he says last week, God can't prevent evil single-handedly, and that word can't was really important. It's not a won't kind of a thing, like God could if he wanted to bad enough, but there are certain things that God simply cannot do. And the Bible talks about this. There are things that God can't do. And one of the things that God does as a loving God is God does not impose God's will on others, doesn't override you. And we all know that that's true because we all continue to make decisions and do some things that not always are lined up with the heartbeat of God. And that's because that's how it is. Also, God can't because God is spirit. God doesn't have literal hands to stop you from doing something, even if it would be harmful for you. It doesn't mean that God is inactive. God is certainly active in the world, and we'll unpack that more and more throughout this series. So today, it's a little more positive thing, so you can take a little deep breath after last week, because that's probably still kind of messing with you, and this whole thing is a process to help you determine your own construct. And like I said at the very beginning of this thing, if you're super happy right where you are with your theology, the way you framed it, God bless you. If it's working for you and if it's making you a more beautiful Jesus-like person, God bless you. That's terrific. However, for a lot of folks, this construct needs to be tweaked. And so that's what we're doing with this series, is trying to get our brains around an incredibly complex subject that will, on the other end, enable us to live, I think, more faithfully and passionately in the world as representatives of Christ and as conduits for Christ. So this week, he's talking about how God feels our pain. And so I asked you a question: how do you know if somebody cares for you? And just call it out. How do you know if somebody cares? Did anybody answer that question, by the way, or were you just too busy eating your donuts? Yeah. It got you tea. All right, he didn't want to answer the question, that's why. But who, oh, that's how you know you're cared for. I get it, an act of service. I thought Carrie was just trying to get out of the question, as she so often does. Okay. How do you know you're cared for? Somebody else. Danny. Yeah, when you're listened to. Very, very good. You couldn't come up with anything. Well, you listened to her, so that was positive. Dar, what'd you have? Okay, that's right, obviously. Yeah.
When people come over and change my bed when I'm too sick to get out.
Awesome. Another act of service kind of thing. Yeah, really good. Yeah. Yeah, they just know that you've been under the weather and they're just checking in on you. Very good. Court?
Bring your wife coffee in the morning.
When somebody brings your wife coffee in the morning, that's terrific. Well, I'm glad somebody's doing that, Court. Yeah, Richard. Yeah, right. Again, when somebody comes to your aid and helps you carry forward, that's all good stuff. So hold on to that as we march forward a little bit, because we're going to move into some of this stuff. Carl Rogers, who was a well-known psychologist, theorist, he said this. He's talking about empathy, which is really feeling people's pain with them. He says, empathy is entering the perceptual world of the other and becoming thoroughly at home in it, which involves being sensitive moment by moment to the changing felt meanings that flow in the other person. Compassion means to suffer with someone. Have you ever pictured God like that? This is more of a question for you to answer in time, but have you ever pictured God as one who doesn't just understand our suffering, doesn't just care about our suffering, but actually suffers with us? Because that's kind of where we're going today. Is that the God that we're experiencing and read about in the Bible and see manifested in Jesus so powerfully, this is a God who is with us in our suffering, not just from a distance feeling sympathetic, like, oh, I'm so sorry for you, that must be really hard. But there is a withiness there for us. And to push it further, where Ord wants to take us in this particular chapter, chapter 2, is that there's a space we can get to where not only do we believe with our heads that God feels our pain, but that we can sense God feeling our pain with us, that we know we're not alone with it. So that's kind of where we're going. But we have a big question to answer when we get to this kind of stuff, this theological stuff. You know, culturally, I know that this has been proved by statistics in our country, that the overwhelming majority of people believe there's a God, and that the God that they believe exists is generally good and loving. That's their general idea of God. So it's not too much of a stretch for you to get to that space of, okay, yeah, I can believe that God, feels our pain and cares about that, because that's our cultural God that we've always looked at. Specifically, though, that's probably not enough. If you're going to bank your life on something, you want something a little more substantive to help you understand, well, how do we really know that that's true? What do we have for evidence on that? And there's experience of lots of people, that's fine. But, we're a people of the book. We're a people of the Bible in two ways. One, if we're Christian, we're sort of default Jewish. I don't know if you knew this, but Jesus wasn't a Christian. You might want to look that up. He was Jewish, and he grew some new ideas out of Judaism that were certainly aligned, but he was deeply Jewish, and the Jewish people are known as the people of the book. Now, our tradition in our church, we come from the Baptist tradition. Now, we're an American Baptist church, which is, when slavery happened, you had Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists, and over time, Northern Baptists changed their name to American Baptists. There's the shortest possible explanation on that. But Baptists in their origins were a people of the book. We got in trouble as a people a few hundred years ago because we dared to read the Bible for ourselves, and we read in there that this baptism thing seemed to be something you do after you figure out what you're believing. And it wasn't experienced as an infant thing. It's a whole different phenomenon. And so these people who gathered in Switzerland, they're reading the Bible for the first time. They're appreciating it. They all were baptized as babies, but they're like, hey, you know what? This seems like a really cool thing to be baptized as a statement of our allegiance to God. And so they did it right there in a river outside of Zurich. And that created all kinds of a mess. And in time, those people who dared to do that were killed by drowning at the very spot they were baptized. So that's Baptist. We are renegades. We think creatively about the Bible. We study it deeply. We're people of the book. And what you need to know is that book that we follow, this Bible, which is a collection of books actually, from cover to cover, it has different authors throughout, but there are these mega themes that show up. And one of these mega themes is that God actually cares, that God actually shows up at our time of pain. There's a really tragic story in Genesis, failed relationship, failed mediation, just a problem spot, where you have Abraham, our patriarch. He has a mistress that was given him by his wife Sarah so that they could bear children. And they got a child for sure. They got Ishmael. And then some years later, many years later, Sarah finally gave birth to Isaac. And Sarah was very jealous for Isaac's sake of Ishmael, the older brother, the first son kind of a thing. And after a period of time, Sarah demanded that Abraham kick out Ishmael and his mother. Didn't want them in the household anymore. And so Abraham did. It's really an awful, awful scene. But you know what's amazing? This Ishmael and his mom go out into the wilderness, and it's blazing hot in the Middle East, and they don't have enough to last very long. And mom senses God's presence. Mom is weeping uncontrollably, and God shows up with her in her pain and gives her a promise that it's not going to be over for them. And so right there early on, we see evidence. In fact, she names him, gives a name to God about God seeing my tears. And there are hundreds of names for God in the Old Testament, and every one of those comes out of an experience. And a lot of those experiences have to do with God providing, God showing up, God being with. And that's kind of where it's at. And so that's a beautiful thing that we have. And then if we look at Jesus, his whole ministry was coming alongside and coming close to, being with people in their pain. If it's a leper colony that needed to be ministered to or healed, he went into the leper colony and was with them in their separateness. If it's a prostitute who certainly didn't choose that on her own, he was with her, wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. And one of his greatest teachings was a story that made people extremely uncomfortable. I think you've probably heard it before. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" So this is kind of a religious lawyer, if you will. And Jesus replied, "Well, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" And the man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him. "Do this, and you will live." But the man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" He's wanting to know, who exactly do I have to spend so much time loving anyway? And you can bet that he wanted a much more narrow definition of neighbor than maybe he was about to get. So Jesus tells a story. Jesus replied with this story: "A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits." Now, at this point, everybody is with him on the story because everybody's heard about this road from Jerusalem down, literally down to Jericho. It was a windy road, and everybody knows you're not supposed to go on this road alone. So everybody hears that this Jewish dude who should have known better got himself into trouble because he went alone on this road when he shouldn't have. And so he got attacked by these bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. So just imagine a lump of flesh bloodied up on the side of the road. You don't know if he's dead or alive. By chance, a priest came along. When he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. And probably for them, they're weighing out, what is the more important thing? Maintaining my purity in case he's dead. I don't want to touch him because that's going to defile me and maybe limit what I'm going to do for God in Jericho when I get there. Maybe that's what they're thinking. But really at stake here is, what does it mean to be a person of God, a representative of God? Who is God in this situation? One that is going to obey the letter of the law or give into the spirit of what the law is all about, which is love and grace. And these two religious leaders missed that memo, and they passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along. Now, this is the New Living Translation. Now, in the original, he didn't need to say despised, because as soon as he said Samaritan, everybody grumbled. The audience Jesus was talking to was Jewish, and they were deeply prejudiced against the Samaritan people. Everybody knew it. They felt they were justified. And so even this parable, what do we call this parable, by the way? You've heard it before. The Good Samaritan, right? It's not called the Samaritan. It's the Good Samaritan. Like there's only one. That's how we need to think about this, because in their way of thinking, there can't be many Good Samaritans. There's probably just one. That gives a hint to the prejudice that was there. So this despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Now let me just say something real quick. You've heard this text before. I've preached on it a number of times. We often think about this through the Jewish lens. Like all these Jewish people, they hated the Samaritans. Well, guess what? The Samaritans weren't exactly fond of Jewish people. And there was a real strong idea that guy who's a lump on the side of the road, you could probably tell just by his clothing where he came from, that he was Jewish and not Samaritan. There are tells that we have, and how we dress, how we present ourselves, what we're wearing, other indicators that let us know. And I'm pretty confident that this guy, this Samaritan, knew the guy that was a lump, that wasn't sure if he was dead or alive. He knew he was Jewish. And he's thinking to himself, is that a good Jew? Can I trust him? Because he's Jewish. Now for you, maybe this isn't quite caught on you yet. And so let me mess with you a little bit here. And I'm not sure where your prejudice is, but I know we all are prejudiced to some degree. We all have biases. That's just the way we are. You cannot live in the world and not have some biases some way or other. And generally we favor our own kind. So I'm not picking on you, okay? But this is pretty normal for us. And it's helpful for us to value the story and really get at what Jesus is trying to say if we're in touch with that reality. So maybe for you, because we don't give a rip about Samaritans anymore, the only Samaritans we have understanding with are this one in a story, and a woman at a well who ends up being a hero of the story. Who's transformed by Jesus. So when we think of Samaritans, it's like, okay, Samaritan, cool, whatever. I'm German. And Dutch. Good for you. What if the guy that's coming up on this road, you got two Jewish priests, religious folks that pass by on the other side. What if now it's a despised Muslim? What if it's clearly an undocumented immigrant? What if it's an African American? Fill in the blank. Get to that visceral place. If you're just honest with yourself, you don't have to tell anybody who's on your list. But that's who I want you to imagine. For you, the least likely person to stop. That's who I want you to see. Because the despised Samaritan came along and he felt compassion for him. And going over to the guy, this guy soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, which was like 2 days' wages, which is more than enough, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. And he asked the guy who asked the lawyer dude who started this whole conversation, says, now which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? And the man replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. When we see this picture, we also forget just what this probably looked like. So you've got this good Muslim, you've got this good undocumented immigrant, you've got this good fill in the blank, and he's walking along, or maybe he's riding his own donkey, and he sees the lump of flesh here, and he gets off because he has compassion, and he goes over, checks his pulse, he finds out he's alive. And now he's got to figure out, what am I going to do with this guy? So he does first aid on the guy as best as he knows how, cleaning his wounds and all that. Then he's thinking, well, I can't leave the guy here. He can't walk. So what does he do? He's got to pick him up. And we don't know how long he's been laying there, but we know he's pretty beat up, right? That means that what this guy is doing, this is more than just writing a check to somebody and say, well, hey, that ought to cover it. No, this guy's getting down. He's getting dirty. He is with the guy in his suffering. He's going to get blood on him because he's choosing to do the compassionate thing. And why is Jesus giving us this story? Because this is the nature of God. This Samaritan got it right. It's about joining with in their suffering because that's who God is. It's going to mess up our clothes. It's going to get our hands dirty, and it's going to cost us some money to do this compassion thing. And that's the point. That's what it is. That's who God is. So that's one of the greatest stories that Jesus ever shared, and we're still talking about it today in all of its intricacies and complexities. But, just looking at Jesus' life, when we think of his the peak of his experience was how he died on a cross. And Ord has something to say about that. He says, in his painful death on a splintered cross, Jesus points to a God who suffers with us. In Jesus, God identifies with those gashed and feeling God forsaken, the homeless and the hurting, the depressed and destroyed. In Jesus' crucifixion, God shares in the suffering of the world and thereby shows solidarity with victims. Jesus reveals a God who empathizes. Remember that God entered into the world extremely poor. He was on the lowest rung of the social ladder, just above prostitutes and tax collectors. He knew what it was like to live a very hard life. He suffered as a boy, as a young man, as an adult, and his death was one of injustice. So that you and I, whenever we suffer, whenever we feel like we've been the recipient of injustice, we know there is somebody who knows, somebody who's been there, who appreciates it, who is with us in our pain. The difference is, you and I, we can be empathetic and compassionate to a certain degree, but there's this actual thing called empathy fatigue. Sometimes it's compassion fatigue. You see this among counselors, social workers, pastors, same thing. And the idea is that when you give yourself to other people and you're with them in their pain for so long, and if you don't take breaks to make sure you're healthy and staying balanced, you get kind of sucked into the pain so much that sometimes you don't get out of it. And you struggle with depression and other things. And so that's why breaks are encouraged. But God is different. God's heart breaks by what breaks us. But this heartbrokenness does not lead God to despair. The God of perfect empathy never gets depressed to the point of immobility. The God of all consolation never suffers empathy fatigue. God's sensitivity and emotion never lead to evil because God's nature is love. God responds to all that is negative, frustrating, and painful with resilient hope. Pain, suffering, and agony never alter God's everlasting love. God feels our pain and can handle it. And that is such good news. But it still gives us the question, how do we experience God feeling our feelings with us? And that's what we're going to get into. But one last little head trip before we get there. These are a handful of views that Ord presents, metaphors for thinking about God that sometimes distort our understanding of God, particularly if we're stuck on one of these more than others, not realizing that metaphors are just that. They're just ways of thinking about things. So some of you have an idea of God or the presence of God as sort of this impersonal brick wall or as gravity. It's just kind of everywhere, kind of like Star Wars, the Force, It's just there, except Except you can't do that cool mind trick, with the Spirit of God, or make your lightsaber, come to you from a great distance, all those kinds of things. But that's kind of the idea, is that it's this impersonal force. It might be there, but it doesn't really care. And so if that's kind of your view, you might want to just hold that and check for a moment, given what we've already talked about. Some folks have an eye in the sky kind of a model. This is a functional deism, where you sense God from a distance. God is in God's heaven, doing whatever God does up there, and really isn't paying a lot of attention, kind of sees what's going on down here, but is not all that involved. Our founding fathers of our country, that's the kind of Christianity that they espoused, was a deism. It was different than what we talk about here in terms of relationship with an active God. Some of us have an idea of God as the CEO of the universe, all about the big picture. So what that looks like is God's trying to look at the sweeping, movements of history and wanting to get everything going toward a wonderful conclusion, big homecoming where he wraps up history and it's all good. And sometimes along that way, he's got to make some course corrections, and he knows that in that process, there are going to be some people who get hurt, but it's unavoidable. It's collateral damage because there's a greater good that's coming. And so sometimes that's going to mean 1 or 2 or a dozen people might get hurt by the CEO's picture. Or in the case of World War II and the Holocaust, could be 6 million Jews. But we all had to do that. You see the problem now? And so we have this idea of the CEO that's trying to do all these good things, and sometimes it costs human lives. And that gets in our way of understanding whether or not God is really with us in our pain. But it's just a metaphor. And are you aware of which metaphors you're holding in tension? The other extreme could be a micromanager, sort of an uncaring determinism way of thinking about God. I've kind of played with all these throughout my life journey. When I was in the micromanager phase, I didn't stay there very long, but I saw some friends that kind of adopted it, and it seemed kind of cool, where like literally everything that happened to you in that day was at the hand of God. God meant everything to happen just as it was. So I took my sandals off just at the right time so that after service I'll forget my sandals. Ed Barker will come up to get his guitar, trip over the sandals, send the mic into the curtain way back there, chip a tooth, and sue the church. All because it was God's will, right? But I would have crazy thoughts like, I can't find my pencil, I can't find my pencil. And then I'd find my pencil, and I was like, well, praise the Lord, I found my pencil, And that kind of minutia, there's a kind of a cool factor to that, because, there are some things that happen in our lives that just kind of seems like God's in the mix somehow. But that's a little different than saying that absolutely everything was orchestrated by God. That's problematic, and there's not much free will in that. Some of us have the idea of God as a clean freak, that he's got dirty handophobia, and he's not going to even mess with us until we get all cleaned up and get our sins forgiven, and then we can have some conversation with God. And that, if that's the way we look at it, then we're going to have a very hard time coming to God with our pain, especially if we cause the pain, or if we're ashamed or feel ashamed by the pain that we deal with because somebody else did something to us. So it's not helpful. Or how about the mob boss? This one's actually still pretty prevalent in our culture. The mob boss says, if you're in good with God, if you're part of God's family, or you're a good friend of God, you're set, man. God has got your back. But if you're not family, not a friend of our Godfather God, it is trouble for you, man. You better kiss the ring and watch your back. Don't get in the boat and go fishing at Lake Tahoe. It's not going to end well. That's kind of the picture of that. And that is a fairly pervasive way of thinking about God in our culture in a particular loud segment of Christianity. If you're in, great. If you're not, watch out. And all of these ways have their limits. They're all metaphor to help us understand what's going on. And I think if we're really trying to get at this experiential reality of God feeling with us, really empathizing, then we have to be aware of these things at work, because each one of these can blind us to the ways that God is interacting with us. So he gives us 6 ways. We'll just jump right through these, and they're pretty good. So his contention is that God's loving empathy can be experienced. And I have to agree. The first thing he talks about is the ministry of human presence, and he talks about counselors. Counselors could be counselors, like professional counselors. They could be spiritual directors. They could be pastors. They could be social workers. These are professionals who are with you for a particular reason, to sort through something, to be a real good listener, to give you feedback on what's happening in your life. And if you've ever been in one of these types of relationships, you know how powerful they can be. I was talking with a guy who I do some coaching with, and he was helping me sort through some things, some paradigms I needed to shift. And we're just sitting there talking. He says one word, and the word he was saying was in passing. It wasn't even like a main point. But it's like as soon as I heard him say this word, I was like, that's the word I got to pay attention to. It was as if the Spirit of God was using him as some kind of conduit to get to me, to say something to me that I needed to hear. And it was such a pivotal thing. It radically opened up my thinking and my feeling about something that's been driving me nuts for a long time. It's amazing what that can do. So counselors offer that, and they're like professional nice people, right? So it's a pretty good bet that as God is working in that process of restoring you, that you may experience something of God in that kind of a session. But it doesn't have to require a professional all the time. Sometimes it's the community of care. And I think when the church is at her best, I don't think there's a better type of community to experience the presence of God. And because we're all here for the presence of God, we're all here trying to figure it out together and be in it and be open to it. And so it makes sense that if we're in a healthy place, when you come here, you already experience something different. There is an openness, there is a grace, there is a welcomeness here. And that's part of who we are. And sometimes that's exactly what you need. Sometimes you just need to know you can come to a place and you're going to be loved. And that is an experience of the body of Christ wrapping around you, with you, to let you know, I am really there. And I'm feeling your pain, I'm feeling with you. When we grieve together, because we do, when we work through people's illnesses and things with each other, those are expressions of God loving you and feeling your pain with you. Mindfulness and meditation and / prayer. What he's trying to get away from here, I think, is laundry list prayer. There's a room for laundry list prayer. And the room for laundry list prayer, where you got a big shopping list for God, the genie, to, tick all these boxes for you. I think the purpose of that is really helpful and good. And it's especially good to get it off your chest. So you've communicated it, this care for all these people and concerns. But at the end of the day, what we're after is relationship with God. And meditation, contemplation, mindfulness, that stuff does this. So Ord says, prayer unmasks our false selves, and we encounter God as we really are. We are people loved by God, in need of transforming grace. We can engage others who face the same internal challenges when we're from that space. And so for you, just in that quiet meditation, that's where God's going to show up. And by the way, if you're figuring this out, if you start to incorporate a lot of these things together, you probably have a lot better shot of actually experiencing an empathic, compassionate God in your life. Next thing, I got a hunch this is going to be, have a lot of folks that resonate with this. Experiences in nature. Any of you feel a little closer to God when you're out hiking around somewhere beautiful? Okay, good. John Muir thought so as well. He wrote this while he was in Yosemite. The place seemed holy, where one might hope to see God. So after dark, when camp was at rest, I groped my way back to that altar boulder and passed the night on it, above the water, beneath the leaves and the stars. Everything still more impressive than by day. The falls seemed dimly white, singing nature's old love song with solemn enthusiasm, while the stars, peering through the leaf roof, seemed to join in with the water's songs. Thanks be to God for his immortal gift. It should be kind of a no-brainer that we feel closer to God when we're in creation, because the Creator's work's right there. There's a kind of a trend It's not really a new idea, but you see it on Facebook and different social media called forest bathing. Are you familiar with that? We used to just call that taking a hike in the woods, but now it's forest bathing. And there's a real thing to that, that the more time you spend in that kind of a setting, it literally lowers your blood pressure. It literally has an impact on you. It's as if you are literally connecting more with God because you are immersed in the nature of God. It's kind of a principle that we don't often think about, but creation itself reflects the Creator. And the more we understand the creation itself, the more we see the fingerprints of God, and the closer we're going to feel. So if you're overdue for a forest bathe, there's all kinds of places. And in fact, we got a small grove of redwoods right out here in our courtyard. So you're welcome to go out there and bathe right after worship. You keep your clothes on for that, by the way. The next thing he talks about is visual arts, music, and movies. How many of you have been deeply impacted, moved by a song that just sort of messed with you and became one of your favorites? For how many of you was that song, or have you ever had a song that moved you in that kind of deep way that was not a Christian song? Okay. How many of you have been deeply moved by music that did not have lyrics, but it was just the music? Anybody? Yeah. I think that's fascinating, don't you? There are some songs that if I'm in the right place, if I'm in the mood, they will absolutely level me. There's one that is consistent that way. It's an old classical song by a composer named Barber. And he has this song, Adagio. If you ever got 10 minutes and want to feel a little depressed, listen to Adagio. It's been used in a lot of movie scores because it's so passionate, and it just starts off so low and mellow, but sad, and just gets to this climax of pain. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. You're dying by the time you get to this. And then it just stops, and then it starts over again, as if to say, you're going to be able to breathe again here, and you're not alone in this. When you have an artist that creates something like that, they are saying, I have experienced this with you. I'm putting this in art form so that you can experience this with me together. And I think God shows up in those things. God shows up in visual arts. There are some pieces of art that we just look at and need to let those things sit with us for a time. There are movies that take us places, deep places of restoration, and help us become more of who we're meant to become. And they don't have to have the Christian badge on them to be used by God. In fact, for most of my life, most of the movies that have had great impact on me have not been Christian. But the themes of reconciliation, restoration, becoming whole, those were deeply present. And where those are, God is. So God shows up in the movies. And the final thing has to do with love of a child. I'll give an addendum to this in a second, but what he's getting at here is there is a lesson learned about love when you are in a healthy space and you have a kid. When I had both of our kids, a crazy thing happens. As soon as they come out of the womb and they're this gooey mess, you immediately fall in love with that kid. You can't not. And what you also realize is that as you're growing this kid, that the love is reciprocated. And they look at you with great love. And that is a great teacher for us about the love of God and how unconditional it is. As we think about our love for our children, and as we think about the love returned, it informs us about God. And I said this 3 months ago when we were on the courtyard, but sometimes God even speaks through what kids are doing with us and saying, it's like God, sometimes kids are the conduit of the Spirit of God, and they're the ones that say just what we need to hear at the right moment. Somehow they're more open to the nudge of God, perhaps, and they say just what we needed to hear. And it's as if God is speaking right through them. Now, the addendum I want to give on this, Because if I don't, it excludes anybody that's never had a kid, or maybe you had a kid, but it wasn't in a healthy circumstance, and you have different kinds of memories altogether with that. But I want to talk about furry kids. Not hairy kids, but fur kids, pets. Because I don't know, but I think probably dogs are the most unconditionally loving creature on the planet. And at least in my experience, and as an adult, I've had 2 amazing dogs who just showed absolute unconditional love all the time. And it doesn't matter if you've left them for 5 minutes and they treat it like it's been, half a lifetime and they're so excited to see you, or if it's just they're wanting to be around you all the time. It is informative for us because you're seeing love given. And not only are you experiencing love coming from this dog, but you also, dogs are a very safe object for our affection. Dogs, when you want to pet that dog and it's your dog and you're its person, that dog is more than happy for you to pet its belly or play or whatever, because that dog is all about you. Sometimes in human relationships, it's not so easy. They're complicated. Sometimes in human relationships, human beings struggle to love one another well and struggle to receive love well, but not dogs. Dogs are great givers of love, and they're great receivers of love. Then there are cats, I guess. Cats, on the other hand, if dogs give us a picture of unconditional love, cats remind us of our self-centered, greedy selves, where it's all about us. Am I right? Am I right? I'm right, yeah. So there we have 6 different ways of thinking about this, and the question for you is, what's your take-home from all this today? This is not a heavy-hitting, deep theological thing like last week was, where I give you a phrase from Ord and it messes with lots of people. This one is more personal, that God feels your pain, and it's true. You have biblical account of people who lived thousands of years ago who didn't have near the technology you did, but yet they recognized that God came alongside and was with them in their struggle. Isaac, Abraham's son, his name was changed to Israel. Israel meant the people of the struggle. But God was with Israel, Isaac, in the struggle. And so I'm wondering what your take-home is. One, maybe it's just for you to finally start to entertain the idea that God cares enough to actually feel our pain. But maybe beyond that, and I hope so, that you'll recognize that you've got some options here to increase the odds of being in relationship with that God who longs to be in relationship with you. That you would know you're not alone in the things that you go through in life. That God is with you, for you, loving you forever. Let's pray together. So God, as we leave this space and return to a busy world with lots of noise and to-do lists and pushes and prods, I pray, God, that we will not lose what happened here today. That we'll even now consider how we can put some of these things into our lives so that we can keep our relationship with you rock solid. That we are open to the experience of your coming near to us. That we'll be flexible and allow ourselves to see and hear and feel you all around us. You are not absent from the world. You are all over this world. We can't escape your presence. So God, help us do what we can do on our part to open ourselves up to you who are with us always. And may we start to realize that we are truly not ever alone in our suffering and pain. Because you're right there with us, loving us through it. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for being here. We're glad you came. Hope you had a good experience. If you know anybody that could use this kind of stuff, please invite them along on the journey. It will be fun. And if you got any information for us or offering, please put those in the baskets on the table. And thank you for coming. See you later.